Hey there, Heather, ho there. It's Jeff Cutter Diamond. Welcome you to yet another Cutter Top 10 NHL video. And today we're going to be looking at the top 10 goalie controversies in NHL history. Of course, as I am a passionate guy loving goalies and all that, wishing to be a goalie in the NHL one day, but my lack of skating, my eyesight, and my overall uh, look just wasn't isn't right for being a goalie. Well, goalies are flakes, and I am partially a flake, if you will. But anywho, we got 10 of the biggest goalie controversies of all time happening. Here we go. Number 10 is Dominic Hasek versus Ed Belfour in the early 90s. So Mike Keenan was known for basically pulling goalies left, right, and center, and he was just upset with goalies and all that. Chicago went through like several goalies in the 1990 season when they sucked. In 91, he had a temperament too, because instead, well, Belfour and Hasek, but he also had Jimmy Waite, Greg Millen, and Jacques Cloutier on the goalie squad as well. So, he had things. But the big thing was Hasek versus Brodeur, or Belfour, excuse me. Ed Belfour came out of freaking nowhere. He played 22 games in the 1989-90 season for the Blackhawks, but because he hadn't hit the 25 game mark, he was still a rookie. And he put up 43 wins for the 1991 Chicago Blackhawks, and they were the heavy favorite to win the Stanley Cup. Unfortunately, though, Belfour and crew would be undisciplined and letting in all those power play goals by the Minnesota North Stars, and they went out in the first round. The Blackhawks had drafted this goalie in 1983 from Czechoslovakia, what it was called at first, but it was Dominic Hasek. He was a great European goalie, but there weren't really a lot of European goalies in the NHL that were powerful and all that. However, Dominic Hasek changed that. He managed to get out from under the Iron Curtain, went to the IHL, the minor league association of the Blackhawks, and then he was up with the Blackhawks playing many games, and then by 92 he was decent. He played great in game 4 of the Stanley Cup Finals, even though they lost to the Penguins, but Hasek was on his head and made a couple of key saves. Unfortunately, the Blackhawks decided to go with Belfour instead of Hasek, and they did have to keep one goalie protected due to the expansion draft with Tampa and Ottawa coming in the league. So they decided to trade Hasek to Buffalo for Stefan Bubigard and a fourth round pick, which ended up being Eric Daze, who was decent when he was healthy. Bubigard did nothing for the Blackhawks and all that. He went over to Germany. Hasek would actually have to spend time backing up Grant Fuhrer, who was traded from the Leafs to Buffalo in February '93 for the one of Dave Anderchuk. So anyhow, the Sabres weren't really too keen on him. They left him unprotected for the '93 expansion draft, but nobody bit and took him, so they had to keep Hasek. But the joke was on Buffalo as Hasek actually came out of nowhere. Yeah, Hasek came out of nowhere because Fuhrer got hurt. Hasek played his heart out, especially in the '94 first round against Martin Brodeur, one of the best goalie duels of all time. So, of course, then the Sabres got rid of Grant Fuhrer to Los Angeles, and Hasek helped Buffalo out, winning a couple of Vezinas and no 6 Vezinas and 2 Hart trophies for MVP, league MVP, not goalie MVP. And that was at technically number 9, Hasek versus Fuhrer. I didn't even look at my notes, but yeah, Hasek versus Fuhrer. That was the big one and all that. But yeah, Chicago kept Belfour for a while and did quite well. All right, number 8 is Carey Price versus Euro Halak 2010 playoffs. Carey Price was this big guy. I think he was drafted 5th in 2005 or something. The Habs needed a goalie, and they decided to pick him in the first round early in 2005. And Carey Price was pretty good. He was brought up little by little. Jose Theodore was traded from Montreal to Colorado for David Appicher, and Price would play backup to Appicher. Carey Price would start to gel in by 2008, and he was decent. Unfortunately, Price had some problems in the 2009 playoffs against Boston, basically raising his hands up, Patrick Waugh style, in mock surrender. And everyone thought Price was going to be traded from Montreal, but nope, they didn't. They kept Carey Price around, but unfortunately, in the 2010 playoffs, the Habs were dead meat. They were down 3 games to 1 to the Washington Capitals, And, Price was replaced by Euro Halak, and that was huge because Halak's heroics basically put Montreal on the map. They took care of the Washington Capitals coming back from 3-1 down, which was rare for a Habs team to do that. They took out the Pittsburgh Penguins, then they had the Philadelphia Flyers, and even though the Habs were the 7th seed and Philly were the 8th seed, no, sorry, Philly was the 7th seed, Montreal was the 8th seed. I was hoping Montreal would beat Philly. Nope, they failed, and the Habs couldn't go to the final against the Hawks. It would have been nice. Price was basically benched. Halak did well, but then Montreal decided to go with Price instead of Halak and traded Halak to St. Louis. He would also play for Washington as well, but smart move is Carey Price would have records for wins by a goalie as a Hab and losses. But still, he's still an icon. And he's a one-team player in history. I think he'll retire soon. Okay. Number 7 is um, Pelle Lindbergh's dilemma 1980s. So the Flyers needed a good goalie. Pelle Lindbergh came over from Sweden. He was part of the 1980 Olympic team with Sweden. Americans will know that because, he was the goalie that played the U.S. in the first game of the Olympics. Lindbergh was trying to help European goalies do well in the NHL. Yuri Serha was not helping matters. But anyway, Lindbergh would do okay for Philly and then regress. And then by 1984-85, with the new system and all that, he realized everything. And Lindbergh won the Vezina for goalie of the year. Lindbergh was on a high. The Flyers were looking pretty good early in the 85-86 season. And in November 1985, Pelle Lindbergh decided to get behind the wheel of his Porsche 911 Turbo, drunk, twice the legal limit in New Jersey. Him and his two passengers crashed into a retaining wall by a school. The 2 passengers survived. Pelle was brain dead, and then his parents in Sweden came over and pulled the plug. Lindbergh was a good goalie, and such a good goalie. He was named starting goalie of the Wales Conference, aka the Eastern Conference, in the All-Star game in 1986, even though he was dead. Doing something that had not been done before, but it has been done since. Sean Taylor was named a starter for the Pro Bowl in 2007, although he died. But the fact of the matter is that, yeah, Pelle's death left a big hole. Bob Froese could do as much as he could for the Flyers, but they failed in the 86 playoffs to the Rangers. And then Ron Hextall, this guy that the Flyers drafted in 1982, if I remember correctly, or 81, can't remember. But Hextall came through. He had pedigree. I mean, his grandfather was Brian Hextall, who was part of the 1940 Rangers and scored the overtime winning goal to help the Rangers win the Stanley Cup that year. He also had his father, Dennis Hextall, or is it uncle? But anyway, yeah, Dennis Hextall there. So Hextall had pedigree. Fans would taunt him, saying, "Buy a Porsche, Hextall, buy a Porsche," because they hated Hextall's guts. Hextall was known as a hacking goalie because, as a goalie, he took lots of penalty minutes and hacked players. Not cool, man. Not cool. Hextall would be okay when he was healthy. I mean, he did win the Conn Smythe in 1987 for playoff MVP, even though the Flyers lost Game 7 to the Oilers. But yeah, that was huge. Number 6 is Marc-Andre Fleury versus Matt Murray 2016 and 17. Marc-Andre Fleury was a pretty good goalie. The Penguins spent their number 1 draft pick in 2003 drafting him. And, that was just big and all that. Picking goalie number 1. The others took Rick DiPietro number 1 overall, and he was hit or miss. Marc-Andre Fleury was okay for Canadian juniors in 2004, getting a silver medal, but he was basically Pittsburgh's only good puck stopper. He was around for a few games, but yeah, Marc-Andre Fleury doing his job. And Pittsburgh went by him. Whether he went, the other team went. Unfortunately, though, Fleury by 2017 was passed over for key playoff spots by Matt Murray, who is this decent goalie. I mean, Murray then got hurt. Marc-Andre came in and helped the Penguins win the 2017 Stanley Cup. So yeah, Murray had 2 Stanley Cup rings and Fleury as well with 2 rings. Unfortunately, though, goaltending was just too much, and the Penguins chose Murray instead of Fleury. and left Fleury unprotected in the expansion draft for Vegas to snap up, and then he helped Vegas in 2018 in their inaugural year get to the Stanley Cup Finals against Washington, but couldn't beat Ovechkin. Luke. Pittsburgh had the issue because Matt Murray was around for a few years, and then he went to Ottawa and Toronto, and basically he's a laughingstock in Leafland because the Leafs wanted some Stanley Cup experience, and Matt Murray didn't help us out one freaking bit, really. Okay, number 5 is Boston's issue: Swayman or Ullmark. So Boston had two very good goalies: Jeremy Swayman from Alaska, Linus Ullmark from Sweden. So Boston decided to put a tandem in. They didn't really pick one over the other for a while. So they had Swayman and Ullmark start a lot of games. This is kind of akin to Detroit in '96 when they had their 62-win season. They didn't really have a number one goalie. It was Osgood and Fernan were both playing, and like Mike Fernan would start a lot of road games, Osgood at home. So they put the tandem system in place. Boston put this tandem with Swayman and Ullmark. Lo and behold, 65 wins. Yay, Boston. But then Boston um had some problems. Yeah, so Boston decided to use Linus Ullmark in net against the Florida Panthers in the first round, and it seemed to work. They're up 3-1. It looked good, and then Ullmark made an uncharacteristic mistake behind the net in Game 5. Saw the Panthers win the game. After Game 6, the Bruins decided, hey, you know what? Let's switch goalies to Jeremy Swayman. Finally giving him the start. They should have given him Game 6 after Ullmark's boo-boo. Swayman did okay, and then last minute, Panthers tied the game, sent it overtime, and Carter Verhaeghe ruined Boston's 65-win season in overtime. It was just shocking and all that. And then, of course, Boston faltered. They chose Swayman over Ullmark, sending him to Ottawa. And Ullmark has had problems in Ottawa, in his first season. He's done decently, but the fact of the matter is that he was under some kind of personal problem and allegedly outed some of his teammates for cheating and all that on their spouses. So what can you do? You just can't do much. Number 4 is Roberto Luongo versus Corey Schneider. So the fact of the matter was that Roberto Luongo was this big goalie. The Islanders had him, and then Florida had him first? No, Islanders had him first, and then stupid Milbury traded him to Florida so that they could get Rick DiPietro first overall. Luongo would be good for Florida. They needed a star goalie and all that. And then once his career, contract expired in 2006, he ended up being a Canuck because his first playoff game as a Vancouver Canuck was that quadruple overtime game against Dallas. And Luongo was strongly becoming Vancouver's best goalie ever. Sorry, Kirk McLean. But the fact of the matter is that Luongo was there. He was the main goalie. He was even captain for a while, but he couldn't have the C on his sweater because of an NHL bylaw. But Luongo played like a great goalie. And in 2011, the Canucks went all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals, lost Game 7 on home ice, which was the stupidest thing in the world, losing to Boston, and Vancouver burned up for a massive riot. Meanwhile, Luongo was struggling. They decided to put Corey Schneider in the net once the Canucks actually ended up losing in 2012 and 2013 in the first round, surprisingly, and all that. There was tension, uncertainty, especially during what they call the quote-unquote outdoor Heritage Classic between the Canucks and the Senators, playing at BC Place, but they had a roof. Schneider was in that, not Luongo. It was just crazy. That Luongo would find himself back to Florida and help Florida out decently before Bobrovsky came through. And Corey Schneider ended up on the New Jersey Devils helping them out. Okay, Vancouver needed new goalies. Number 3 is the Leafs transition from Ed Belfour, from Curtis Joseph to Ed Belfour. The Leafs have had some goalie issues. I mean, you could say that the whole Sawchuck Bauer thing in the mid-'60s was a goalie controversy because the NHL had what they called the intra-league draft, in which, teams can draft players off other players for negotiation. And the Leafs picked up Terry Sawchuck after Detroit just dumped him off. So the Leafs went with a tandem of Bauer and Sawchuk, and one was better than the other, if you will. Bauer was not a career Leaf. He played a lot for the Leafs, but he did have a few seasons with the New York Rangers before they sunk him to Cleveland, and the Leafs picked him up from the AHL team in 1958. Anywho, yeah, Bauer and Sawchuk was just huge. Bauer ended up being the star goalie. Sawchuk was unprotected, and the Kings took him in the 67 expansion draft. The Leafs have had some other goalie things, like Mike Palmateer coming out of freaking nowhere. You actually had a controversy between Felix Pontin and Cujo in the 98-99 season. Felix was doing well for the Leafs. The Leafs just couldn't get anything going offensively. And then a chance meeting between Leafs GM Ken Dryden, yes, he was the Leafs GM at one time, and Curtis Joseph's player agent, what's his name? The player agent, Brian Smith? Probably not. I can't remember. But yeah, his player representative, his agent, led to Dryden actually going for Cujo and getting him from the Edmonton Oilers in free agency. King Felix was feeling left out. He figured his plans were done, and the Leafs traded him to the New York Islanders for Brian Berard in that trade, if I remember right. But yeah, Cujo was the star goalie for the Leafs. The Leafs helped him out. He got the Leafs to 2 conference finals, and unfortunately, they failed. So Cujo left for Detroit trying to get a cup with the Red Wings, but it failed miserably. He had a couple of terrible playoff runs, including losing to the Ducks in the first round, the Mighty Ducks at that. And Ed Belfour luckily left Dallas for Toronto, and the Leafs were hoping Ed Belfour would be the key piece to the puzzle. He was for a while, and then Belfour started getting older, so he left for Florida. And the Leafs put the hopes on Andrew frickin' Raycroft and all that, which is the stupidest thing the Leafs could have ever done. Well, trading away Tuukka Rask for Raycroft was terrible. But yeah, it was about loyalty and performance, and the Leafs have had goalie controversies for years to come, especially Stoller versus Wall nowadays. Number 2 is Ken Dryden, his stand-up in 1973. Ken Dryden was this big 6'4" goalie, a giraffe called by Phil Esposito, or a bleeping octopus. Anyway, Boston owned his rights, then traded him in '64 to Montreal for a couple of players that didn't last long in Boston. Dryden's rights were there. Dryden actually went to Cornell to play in the NCAA and actually only lost 4 games in 3 years, which was big, and Cornell was the new NCAA powerhouse. So Montreal wasn't sure how to do it. He did well in the AHL, and then Montreal decided to bring him up for 6 games. He won all 6. They named him the starter in the 1971 Stanley Cup playoffs, and not Rogie Vachon or Phil Meyer, who would go on to do better things late in the 70s. Vachon for the Kings and Phil Meyer for the Atlanta Flames. So anyhow, Dryden proved everyone wrong, winning the Conn Smythe for playoff MVP and helping the undermanned Montreal Canadiens, who were supposed to get slaughtered by the Boston Bruins in the first round of the 71 playoffs. But they didn't. They won in 7, and Montreal won the Stanley Cup. Dryden would win Calder for Rookie of the Year in 1972, which was strange because he was still technically a rookie. Anywho, after his 3rd season, and winning his 2nd Stanley Cup, he felt like he should be paid more because, he's the goalie of 2-time Stanley Cup champs. Montreal wouldn't budge, so he decided to do his stuff as a lawyer. He was articling and lawyer. So he went to a Toronto law firm. He played defenseman in a house league, in an adult league. And, Ken Dryden just left it. Montreal had to deal with Wayne Thomas and Michel Place and a few other goalies trying to be number 1, even Buddy LaRock. Montreal fell flat in the 74 playoffs, so Montreal caved and gave Dryden lots more moolah. He helped them to the semifinals in 1975, and then, of course, the 4-time Stanley Cup champion. 4 straight Stanley Cups from 76 to 79, and then he decided to retire, shockingly, because he felt like, he had nothing to prove. He went to Parliament, he wrote a couple of books, and now he's deceased. I feel bad for that. Anyway, number 1 is Patrick Roy leaving Montreal. This was huge. This was really huge. Patrick Roy was the face of Montreal for many, many years. He came in as a fresh-faced rookie in the 85-86 season and shocked a lot of people by being the number one goalie for the playoffs. Unfortunately for Roy's detractors, he helped them out with a 16-6 mark in Montreal winning the 1986 Stanley Cup, where no one thought that was going to happen. Roy would be good, but he had kind of a tandem with Brian Hayward, who was pretty much the most well-paid backup goalie in the NHL. Hayward didn't like the fact that they liked Wow over him, so he left for the Minnesota North Stars, then San Jose Sharks. Wow was in net for Montreal for many years, and then by 1992-93, Habs fans actually weren't too happy with him. And after two straight losses in the first round to the Quebec Nordiques, they were begging for Andre Red Light Rasico in the nets. But Jacques Demers said, no way, I'm going with Wow all the way, basically staking his reputation. And it worked. Montreal would win 10 overtime games in those playoffs and win the Stanley Cup over the Kings. But in 95, once Jacques Demers led Montreal to an 0-5 start, he was dumped, and in a surprise move, Mario Tremblay, who was doing color commentating on the French language Habs broadcast, actually decided to be the coach, and then they named Ray-Jean Houle, or known as Peanut, as GM. Tremblay had a stormy start when Tremblay tried to explain about beating Toronto. We had to play toe to toe with them and said toast to toast or toast to toast, and made fun of his English. So anyway, there was a rocky move, and then December 2nd, 1995 happened. The powerful Detroit Red Wings came to town for the last time as the forum was closing soon. So anyway, the Red Wings jumped out to a 9-1 lead, and Patrick Roy was in net for all 9 goals. And finally, Patrick Blonsky came in to replace him. Roy went to the backup stool, and then all of a sudden he saw Mario Tremblay kind of had a smug look. So Roy doubled back to Ron Corey, the Habs owner, and basically barked, "This is my last game in Montreal." And it was. Ray-Jean Houle made the move to Colorado as Patrick Roy did not want to be traded. Well, Montreal needed to trade Patrick Roy away from the Eastern Conference and to the Western Conference into a contender. Colorado would be more than happy to oblige, sending Jocelyn Thibault, Andrei Kovalenko, and Martin Rusinski to Montreal for Mike Keane, who was Habs captain at the time, and Roy. Martin Tremblay did admit he should have pulled Roy after the first period and all that, but said that Roy would bounce back. And of course, a lot of things happened. Colorado would actually pick up the pieces, beat Detroit in the 96 Western Final, win the Stanley Cup over the Panthers, and give Roy a cup. And no, he was not named Conn Smythe winner. That was Joe Sakic. Worst part was that Roy led the Avalanche to the Stanley Cup in 2001. Ray Bourque's last stand, finally winning the Stanley Cup, and Roy was named Conn Smythe guy for the third time in his history. So yeah, Roy won 4 cups, 2 in Montreal, 2 in Colorado, and worst of all, Montreal fell in a goalie slump. Jocelyn Thibault had massive pressure because he's from the province of Quebec, and he failed miserably in everyone's eyes. So that was that, and Montreal didn't pick up the pieces till Jose Theodore helped Montreal in 2002. So Cal Dommage, Montreal just needed the ghost of Ken Dryden or something like that. But anyway, that's all I've got for these goalie controversies. I'm Jeff Diamond. Adieu.